Charlotte Lewis packed everything she needed to take with her to her country house. A change of clothes, some medications, and a few packets of seeds for the flower beds that the woman rightfully considered her pride. Mrs. Lewis did not forget about her beloved cat either, Duke, and prepared a cat carrier for him. Feeling the mood of his owner, the pet meowed sweetly, anticipating the imminent journey. "Well, now we can hit the road. I'll stay there for a week or two, plant the flowers, and then I'll come back," Mrs. Lewis thought with a smile and picked up the cat carrier. Charlotte Lewis bought her house in the suburbs of Boston 5 years ago, after her son Stephen died in a terrible car accident. The death of her son obviously came as an extremely painful shock for the single elderly woman, which unsettled her for a long time. After all, she considered her son to be a real hero. He had fought in Iraq back in his youth and even had several government awards, which he kept in his desk drawer. Charlotte Lewis shed many bitter tears before she could come to terms with the loss of her only loved one and find the strength to live on. Mrs. Lewis's husband died 20 years ago of a heart attack, and therefore her son always came first in her life. For almost her entire adult life, Charlotte had worked as an English teacher at school and was used to being the center of attention. And only chronic diseases caused by old age forced Mrs. Lewis to quit her job and take the well-deserved rest. Unfortunately, the death of her son forever divided her life into before and after. After the incident, Charlotte Lewis found solace in growing flowers at her country house. However, as she bought the house 5 years ago, many of her acquaintances condemned the woman for it, hinting at her advanced age. Mrs. Lewis always responded with a mysterious smile, claiming that she had never once regretted buying that house. Of course, taking care of the flower beds and fighting weeds from dusk till dawn wasn't easy, but the woman had long been accustomed to hard work and believed that a person only remains truly alive until they stop working. And given that Charlotte Lewis recently celebrated her 18th birthday, one could really believe in her theory. Since the country house wasn't that close, the woman decided to use public transportation and went to the bus stop. Meanwhile, Duke was behaving surprisingly well in his carrier, courageously enduring the inconvenience. Mrs. Lewis deliberately took the window seat on the bus and was enjoying the pleasant view that unfolded before her eyes. The woman knew that in another half an hour, she would find herself back in the realm of beautiful flowers that were waiting for her in the garden. The time spent on the road flew by quickly, and when Mrs. Lewis finally found herself at the gates of her house, located on a quiet, shady street, her surprise knew no bounds. "What the heck is that? Who would make such a mess?" the old woman whispered in bewilderment as she slowly put the cat carrier on the ground. At that very moment, tears started flowing down Mrs. Lewis's face, burning her wrinkled cheeks. The fact was that the old woman's perfectly mowed lawn now had a huge pile of garbage on it, most of which consisted of empty beer bottles and cigarette butts. The old woman had been vacationing in her country house for several years and had never encountered such barbarity. Unable to stop crying, she looked around and saw a lot of expensive cars were parked near the neighbor's house, which meant that they were holding some kind of gathering at their place. Charlotte Lewis knew that her neighboring house was occupied by young people who moved into it about a month ago. Could they really be responsible for this mess? "I probably shouldn't rush to conclusions. I didn't catch them red-handed," the old woman whispered. She picked up the cat carrier and went into the house. Meanwhile, she simply couldn't wrap her head around the fact that one of the local residents could be so rude. Mrs. Lewis understood that it was highly unlikely that some random passerby had dumped all their garbage on her lawn. But before she even had time to let Duke out of his carrier, she heard loud music and someone's drunken cries coming from the neighbor's house. The sounds were so loud that a flash of pain instantly pierced Mrs. Lewis's head, threatening to turn into a violent migraine. Having looked with disapproval towards the neighbor's house, the old woman closed all the windows and got to cleaning the house. Being busy with work, Mrs. Lewis didn't even notice when the day came to an end, and the evening brought a pleasant coolness. In the meantime, the celebration next door was getting so wild that even the tightly closed windows and doors could no longer save Mrs. Lewis from the loud sounds of music. "This is just too much. At this rate, I'll end up staying up all night," thought Mrs. Lewis, grimacing. Unfortunately, with the onset of darkness, the sounds from the neighbors became even louder, turning into a continuous, monotonous hubbub. The horrendous music scared Mrs. Lewis's cat, so he hid under the bed and anxiously watched what was happening. Realizing that it couldn't go on like this forever, the old woman resolutely opened the door and headed for the neighbor's house. Mrs. Lewis had spent at least 20 minutes knocking on the door of the loud neighbors. To the great surprise of the old woman, the door was opened by a young woman of about 25, with traces of obvious alcohol intoxication on her face. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Without any preamble, asked the woman. "Good night, miss. My name is Charlotte Lewis, and I'm your neighbor. Could you turn the music down a bit?" the old woman muttered timidly. The woman smiled slyly in response, took a sip of wine from the glass that was standing on a table in the living room, and answered, "And why should I do that? This is my house, and I have every right to do whatever I want in it. We have something to celebrate today, so why are you bothering me?" Looking into the tipsy eyes of her neighbor, Mrs. Lewis realized that it was pointless to try and reason with her. The woman standing in front of her wasn't going to meet her halfway, but seemed ready to defend her rights, even if she had to physically fight the old woman. Now, Mrs. Lewis was sure that it was her neighbors who dumped that pile of garbage on her lawn. Hanging her head, the old woman returned to her house, and having taken a couple of sleeping pills, tried to go to bed. Unfortunately, she only managed to fall asleep early in the morning, when the celebration next door had finally subsided a bit. Unfortunately, all the noise and the sleepless night caused the old woman to suffer from severe headaches and high blood pressure all day. "It's okay, I just have to hang in there for a day, and then I'll get enough sleep tonight, and it'll all get better," thought Mrs. Lewis, anxiously looking at her watch. However, to the old woman's great surprise and disappointment, as soon as it started getting dark, the music next door was blasting at full volume once again. At this point, the poor old Mrs. Lewis got the impression that the neighbors were deliberately harassing her, trying to achieve some goal only they knew about. "This is impossible. They can't be doing this," the old woman exclaimed and reached for her phone that was lying on the bedside table. She decided to call the police. Desperately embarrassed by the sound of her own voice, Mrs. Lewis complained about the noise coming from her neighbors. "Well, ma'am, please remain calm. We will send a patrol car to your address," answered a pleasant male voice on the other end of the line. Unfortunately, Mrs. Lewis had to wait a very long time for the arrival of the police. However, a couple of minutes before the patrol car finally arrived, the neighbors had turned off their loud music. The officer on duty took both the neighbors' and Mrs. Lewis's statements. The old woman was horrified to learn that her neighbors flat out refused to admit to her guilt. The young woman claimed that it was all in Mrs. Lewis's head, and that she was an old, senile lady who chose the poor young woman as her victim for her harassment. Mrs. Lewis involuntarily blushed from being so unfairly accused and basically slandered. "Ma'am, if this happens again, I'll have to take you to the station and issue a fine for a false call and for lying to the police," the officer said in a displeased tone, feeling that he had wasted his time. As it turned out, Mrs. Lewis's neighbor's name was Wendy Simmons, and she was the daughter of a wealthy businessman who was well known among the city's elite. Now, Charlotte Lewis realized that the impudent woman was causing her discomfort on purpose, trying to get rid of the elderly neighbor. Therefore, the old lady wasn't surprised when the neighbor turned on the loud music again the next day, only this time she didn't hesitate and called the police immediately. Unfortunately, just like the first time, Wendy Simmons turned the music off about 5 minutes before the arrival of the police, making Charlotte Lewis look like an old liar again. "Ma'am, that's it. You'll have to come to the station at 10 a.m. tomorrow to deal with the situation," the police officer muttered through his teeth, having handed the old woman a ticket. "Well, that's new. Now everyone thinks I'm just an old senile woman," Mrs. Lewis whispered with tears in her eyes. And when the patrol car finally left, the music next door turned back on and seemed to be even louder than before. The next day, Charlotte Lewis was worried sick before her visit to the police station. She even put on her best clothes. The unfortunate old woman understood that she'd probably have to take on the entire law enforcement system, as they didn't even bother trying to learn the truth, taking the rich woman at her word. As soon as Mrs. Lewis walked into the police station, she immediately felt the mocking gaze of the police officers. Many of them whispered and pointed at the bewildered old woman, hinting that she had lost her mind and tried to slander her neighbors. Poor Mrs. Lewis was overcome with emotions, so much so that she involuntarily unclenched her hand and the old purse she was carrying fell to the floor. Her son had bought her this purse many years ago. As the bag was falling, it flew open and its contents got scattered all over the floor. In addition to some makeup and a small wallet with a handful of change, there was a photograph of Mrs. Lewis's deceased son. Blushing with embarrassment, Mrs. Lewis tried to quickly gather her things and put them back into her purse. At that very moment, the head of the investigation department appeared next to her. Seeing him, all the officers in the department tensed up visibly. "Is there a problem, ma'am?" asked the officer, helping the old woman pick up the change. "No, sir, I'm all right. Thank you. It's just my arthritis," Mrs. Lewis replied, feeling embarrassed. At that moment, the officer noticed the photograph of the old woman's late son, which she always carried in her purse. "Stephen Lewis? Ma'am, where did you get this picture?" the police officer asked in surprise. "That's a picture of my son, Stephen. He died 5 years ago." "Why are you asking?" the old woman said. At that moment, the officer's face changed. He took Mrs. Lewis by the hand and sat her at the table. Then, having treated the old woman to a cup of fresh tea, he began his story. As it turned out, Stephen Lewis and Robert Johnson served together in the Marine Corps back in their youth. They were both stationed in Baghdad during the war in Iraq. Stephen and Robert fought side by side, and risking their lives together on a daily basis, they knew the true value of friendship. Unfortunately, when their contracts had ended, their lives took different paths and they lost touch. And only now, so many years later, their paths crossed again in a completely unpredictable way at the Boston Suburban Police Station. The news of Stephen's death saddened Robert Johnson, and he caught himself thinking that he had to help his late friend's mother no matter what. After all, Stephen had once saved his life in the war-torn city. After carefully listening to the story of Charlotte Lewis, Officer Johnson promised to personally look into the situation and punish those responsible. Let me get ahead of myself and tell you that the former Marine kept his word and achieved justice by punishing not only the old woman's neighbor, but also the officers who mocked the elderly woman. On her way home, Mrs. Lewis took a photo of her late son from her purse and kissed it tenderly. "Thank you, Stevie. I know it was you who helped me out," the old woman whispered, brushing away a tear. Looking into her son's blue eyes, Charlotte Lewis was sure that Stephen was now watching her from heaven, and just like 5 years ago, was smiling sweetly at his beloved mother.